Hey everyone, welcome to today's Advantage Workshop. We are so glad you could join us for this important session, Clearing the Air, Achieving AAMI Compliance for Chemical Sterilization. Chemical sterilants play a critical role in sterile processing, but they also present compliance and safety challenges that can't be ignored. Today, we're joined by industry leader Alex Hilliker, Executive Vice President at ChemDAC, who will walk us through the new ANSI AAMI ST58 standards, revised in 2024, and what they mean for your teams, your compliance strategy, and most importantly, your staff's safety. So let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Alex.
Thanks, Vanessa. I appreciate the kind introduction. It is awesome to be here. Thanks to you, Jamid, and the ASSI team. It's awesome to be able to do this live and to have this conversation with so many of you that are tuning in this afternoon. We are back to school. It's football season. Everybody's busy. The fact that you take 30 to 45 minutes to learn with us and to chat with us and to have a dialogue means the world to us. So really appreciate your support. As Vanessa said, my name is Alex Hilliker. I'm the Executive Vice President at ChemDAC. We are a safety company based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and our mission is to empower teams to eliminate workplace exposure to hazardous chemicals. So as Vanessa mentioned, this is something that we're incredibly passionate about. It means the world to us that you're taking the time to learn with us today. So I am joined by Jamid Billingsley and Vanessa Frank. Publicly, I just want to say thank you to both of you for your support and encouragement to do this workshop. I can't speak highly enough of your support to the ChemDAC team. And I'm happy to say that you'll be sticking around for the question and answer portion at the end of this workshop. If you wouldn't mind, if you could please introduce yourself to folks that may not know you, and maybe mention a little bit about what this topic means to you personally. So Jamid, can we start with you?
Of course. Well, you're quite welcome for the support, and I'm excited about this because I am a more experienced operator as in this field, and I know in the past a lot of times we hoped that people were looking out for our best interest, and I think it was a huge goal of mine, and I was glad to get support for Alex to make sure that AAMI ST58 did a good job of making sure that we had guidelines so that we can look out for our staff. Our staff can be taken care of because we're going to have a life after sterile processing, and I want that to be a fulfilling life.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. Vanessa Frank. This topic means a lot to me because I think in sterile processing, we get used to having chemicals all around us, from point of use treatment, hopefully it's happening all the way through to your disinfection, your sterilization. And I think we start to take them for granted as, hey, look, it's a colorful chemical in a bottle, la-di-da, when really it could really mess up your day. So to have this conversation and hear from Alex about the updates to ST58 is really exciting for me.
Awesome. Thank you both. And for folks that may just be joining here a couple of minutes into the workshop, Jamid and Vanessa will be sticking around for the question and answer portion at the end. So if you've got questions for them, they're incredible resources and experts in this field as well. So thanks to both of them for sticking around. All right, so here's the flow. What are we going to talk about today? So for those of you who've been following along with our Tip Tuesdays, you know that first and foremost, we're going to be talking about what is AAMI ST58, what was changed, and why were those changes made. I want to say up front, and this won't surprise most of you that are watching, I'm sure, we're going to focus a lot on the increased emphasis on staff safety in the new update for AAMI ST58. So our second objective is we're going to zoom in on the chemicals that are being used, primarily hydrogen peroxide as the chief sterilant that's being used in modern sterile processing departments, and then also peracetic acid. This is going to help kind of reinforce and explain the rationale for some of the changes that were made, again, with that big emphasis in ST58 on staff safety, team member safety in SPD. Then we're going to zoom back out for our third and fourth objectives. Of course, we're going to talk about practical work strategies and things that you can do with your team to ensure compliance, and then talk about some of the tools and technologies that are available to help you do so. So first and foremost, what is AAMI ST58? Sometimes, this gets lost in the shuffle with ST79 and ST91 and ST98. So for those of you that I should say are less familiar, AAMI ST58 is the standard for chemical sterilization and high-level disinfection for healthcare facilities. So the 2024 means that this standard was just recently updated last year at the end of 2024. Important to note that this is the first time that this particular standard has been updated since 2013. So the reason for that, when you think about that over the 11, 12 years in between the updates, a lot of changes in the chemistry, a lot of changes in the technology that's being used, new validated approaches for sterilization and disinfection. So definitely was the right time to make this update. I do want to say publicly as well, I think we actually might have a couple of members of the AAMI working group that worked on updating this standard. What a tremendous job that you all did. Very comprehensive. I know that this took 5 years of hard work to update. And I should also recognize the committee as well for winning a technical committee award for their efforts on updating SD58. Hats off. Job well done, and thanks for taking the time to invest in making sure that we are safely and effectively using chemicals in sterile processing. So as some of you may know, this is a very wide-ranging standard. It's a 250-page document. As you see here on the slide, it covers key areas like work area design, personnel and staffing considerations, which is critical as you think about who you're bringing in to support the heartbeat of the hospital. Of course, it talks about decontamination processes and quality control. And I think critically for this conversation, considerations for the safe and effective use of both liquid and gas chemical sterilants and high-level disinfectants. Again, you'll hear me talk throughout the next 20 minutes or so about this emphasis on staff safety, which is a big driver for this discussion. So what are some of the big changes from the 2013 version? Well, one of the biggest ones, for those of you that have been following AAMI standards for some time, is that ST41 is now retired. ST41 was the AAMI standard for the use of ethylene oxide in hospital sterilization. ST58 now has absorbed ST41, and it's expanding on that information on ETO use and applying it to other chemicals as well. So there are new appendices specific to hydrogen peroxide and peracetic acid. There is a brand new Annex P, which is focused on gas and vapor monitoring and key considerations there. And then as you see at the bottom of the slide there, I think it's important to highlight that AAMI really drives home this point of staff safety by saying that all managers of locations where chemicals are used have clearly defined responsibilities to monitor and minimize worker exposure to chemical vapors. Could not have said it better myself. I think that's a really great one-sentence summary of what it is that we're going to be talking about in this workshop. So I want to talk about ST41 for a second, the now retired standard for ETO. It talked about how to use it, why to use it, how to keep your team safe. As you see there, ventilation requirements, monitoring and safety protocols. We like to say that ST41 laid the groundwork and did a tremendous job of taking a look at kind of these key areas of the safe and effective use of ethylene oxide, which, as I mentioned, are now being applied and adopted for other chemicals. So there are still facilities out there using ethylene oxide. If your facility is using ETO, by all means, reach out if you've got specific questions about the new guidance related to ETO for your facility. Myself and ChemDAC and the ASSI team would be happy to support you. Really, the bulk of this presentation is focused on hydrogen peroxide as the primary sterilant that's being used, as well as peracetic acid as the chief high-level disinfectant. So why did AAMI decide to make these changes? What's the rationale? So I want to start just by saying, first and foremost, why we're using chemical sterilants and high-level disinfectants in the first place. When you think about it, sometimes, as Vanessa mentioned in the introduction, sometimes we just get used to working around these chemicals all day, and we're not even necessarily thinking about why we're using them. And when you really think about it, it's to kill the bad stuff. It's to kill germs and bacteria and viruses and pathogens. The problem is these chemicals are not smart enough to discriminate between the bad stuff and healthy human cells. So not a huge leap to understand that overexposure to these chemicals can be unsafe. So as you see there on the slide, the first piece of rationale that AAMI provides throughout the standard, this is mentioned many times throughout ST58, is that odor is an unreliable indicator of a safe concentration of a chemical vapor. The problem that some people may not know is that you can't see, smell, or taste hydrogen peroxide at low levels, for example. So if there's a small amount of hydrogen peroxide in the air in the department, say 1 part per million, you wouldn't even know if you're being exposed. And of course, peracetic acid has the opposite problem, right? If you've worked around peracetic acid, you've worked around peracetic acid. You smell the strong, pungent vinegar odor. It can be a little bit irritating, but our noses are not calibrated in parts per million, I like to say. Also, everybody has different levels of sensitivity. And when you work around the same chemical every day, like peracetic acid, we tend to go nose blind, this phenomenon called olfactory fatigue. Those of you that have kids in youth sports like I do, you're very familiar with the concept of olfactory fatigue. When you walk into a locker room and smell your kids' gear and things like that, and they have no idea what you're talking about. The same thing can happen when you're working around a chemical like peracetic acid. So odor is not a reliable indicator. The plan cannot be, hey, tell me if something smells super strong over by the AER or the sterilizer. The second point, the second piece of rationale that AAMI lays out, again, multiple times throughout the updated standard, is that sterilizers can and sometimes do fail. Of course, AAMI stresses that the manufacturers of the sterilization equipment are prioritizing user safety, but AAMI notes that sometimes things happen, right? Things go wrong, machines break, there's human error, and we need to be prepared for the possibility and the probability of things not going according to plan. OSHA reminds us with the general duty clause that it's our duty to provide a safe working environment that's free from known hazards, and that includes chemical safety. The third point that kind of ties everything together is that the technology exists for us to be able to do this effectively, reliably, and safely. The world that we live in, just requires us to always have data and information. Sometimes we're kind of overloaded and bombarded with this information, but that's what we become accustomed to: real-time, continuous sources of information so that we can make decisions. And that's what continuous monitoring is all about. And that's a key piece of rationale that AAMI notes in this updated standard from late last year. So, of course, you also want to be thinking about, when we start to think about what to do about this, you want to think about personal protective equipment, PPE. You want to think about SOPs, but you also want to do some consultation. You want to talk to experts. And I think that AAMI does a great job of encouraging SPD leaders to talk to the suppliers of the chemicals, to look at the safety data sheets and understand what's on them, how to handle safely the chemicals that we're using throughout the day, every day in the department, but also to talk to the manufacturers of the sterilizers and of the gas monitoring equipment. And that brings me to a key point that I want to make today, and that's that we are all on the same team when it comes to the safe and effective use of chemical sterilants and high-level disinfectants. AAMI reflects that certainly in this guidance. And I think it's really sound advice that we would encourage everybody to adhere to inform the decisions that you make when it comes to compliance with this updated standard. So wanted to call out this, I mentioned this is a 250-page document. So I wanted to call out some specific examples of what it is that we're talking about this afternoon that really kind of help demonstrate the changes that were made and the rationale behind those changes. So if you look at Annex F, for example, it notes clearly that gas and vapor emissions can occur from even the best made equipment. And there it is, odor is an unreliable indicator of the presence and concentration of peracetic acid, hydrogen peroxide below hazardous concentrations. Annex I is specifically talking about hydrogen peroxide, vaporized hydrogen peroxide sterilization. And it specifically says that vapor monitoring is recommended if there's the potential for hydrogen peroxide vapor concentration to exceed the OSHA recommended permissible exposure limits. Now, we're going to talk about that in just a couple of slides, but you should know that there are independent studies that are out there that have demonstrated the potential for this to happen. And so when you combine that with the fact that, as Amy notes, sometimes equipment can and does fail, I think it's safe to say that vapor monitoring is recommended pretty strongly in this new standard. And then the third piece, regular monitoring is available to help ensure that ambient vapor concentrations are below the OSHA PEL or other recognized exposure limits. I think that's key to what we're going to talk about in just a couple of slides here, because the OSHA permissible exposure limits are not all inclusive or comprehensive. And there's other organizations that have stepped up to ensure we provide a safe working environment as well. So why does this matter for you? I think most of our viewers today are probably people that are working in sterile processing departments in either technician or leadership roles, or are regularly in the department to perform their job function. Non-compliance with ST58 or partial compliance with ST58 does have some serious repercussions if you're not meeting the standard and the recommendations. Namely, you can slow down the operations of your department. So if there's a spill, for example, if there's improper chemical use, if there needs to be an evacuation of the department, this is creating inefficiency in the department. And it's in addition to the negative health impacts, of course, that it can cause. I always like to say that staff safety, SPD staff safety, is patient safety. And staff efficiency in the SPD is definitely patient efficiency and getting procedures completed on time. The other thing that this helps you to do is it helps you to be proactive, because when you're monitoring for chemical concentrations in your department, you're monitoring personnel worker exposure, occupational exposure, but you're also measuring machine performance. And if you start to see trends of increased concentration in your department, you can actually get preventive maintenance before there's a bigger problem. So it adds that level of proactive safety to your department. So as we transition into the next part of the conversation, I want to note just this quick summary slide. And I will say that these slides will be made available to you after the presentation as well. There's a host of benefits to complying with ST58 2024, namely that you're using the right chemicals at the right place at the right time to increase that effectiveness of sterilization and disinfection. And you have a better understanding of your sterile processing environment. If you're paying attention to the guidelines in ST58, you're going to be much more proactive than reactive. You're going to create a safer and more effective environment for your team. So let's zoom in, like I talked about in the objectives. Let's zoom in a little bit on the two chemicals that are most common in sterile processing departments today, namely hydrogen peroxide and peracetic acid. Before we do that, I just want to talk about a couple of definitions so that we're all on the same page with what we're talking about. Now, I know that many of you may be familiar with these, so bear with me as I catch some others up. When we talk about exposure limits, the one that's talked about most often is the permissible exposure limit, or PEL. This is the OSHA legal limit for exposure to a hazardous substance. Now, PELs are typically expressed in terms of a time-weighted average, or TWA, and there's two different layers, if you will, to a time-weighted average. There's a long-term exposure limit. That's the PEL, that's the permissible exposure limit, and that's the concentration over a typical work shift that you can be exposed to an 8-hour period. There's also a short-term exposure limit. This is the maximum exposure that you're allowed for a 15-minute period in terms of a time-weighted average. Now, important to understand that both of these are very, very important. There's the long-term chronic exposure is typically looking at lower levels, say with ethylene oxide, 1 part per million, versus a little bit of a higher level, a short-term exposure limit using ethylene oxide as an example of 5 parts per million. Both of these are important because the STEL, the short-term exposure limit, that's typically where you're going to see the most opportunity for overexposure in the sterile processing department. That acute exposure, think about it when you're opening a sterilizer door or changing out the AER. That's where you've got the potential opportunity to exceed that short-term exposure limit. That's something that frankly isn't really talked about enough with the focus on the PELs of the 8-hour time-weighted average. So there's also a couple other definitions I want to make sure that we throw out. The first is a level that NIOSH publishes, and that's the immediately dangerous to life or health level, the IDLH. As it sounds, that's the concentration that poses that immediate danger to your life or health. But I think an important part of the definition that sometimes gets left off is that also it's the level that could prevent your escape. So if you are so irritated, let's say your eyes are stinging or watering and you can't find the door, you may be near that IDLH level. And then I mentioned that other organizations, in addition to OSHA, step up and put out occupational exposure limits. ACGIH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, that's one of those organizations. They put out something called the Threshold Limit Value, or TLV. And then you've got the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that puts out something called the Acute Exposure Guidelines. So going back to that big tent philosophy, we're all on the same team. There are lots of references and places to go to make sure that you are achieving the intent in ST58 of chemical safety and compliance in your department. Let's talk about hydrogen peroxide for a second. Hydrogen peroxide is a very common chemical that is used ubiquitously in healthcare and in the home. Some of you may know that hydrogen peroxide it's in shampoos, it's in toothpaste, it's in laundry detergent. More commonly, people think of it in the little brown bottle in the drugstore. The problem is, because it's so common and because it's such a recognizable chemical, we often underestimate the impacts of overexposure to hydrogen peroxide from a human health standpoint. And that's primarily due to the concentrations that are being used. When you think about the little brown bottle, that's a 3% concentration of hydrogen peroxide. And then when you compare that to what's used in a vaporized hydrogen peroxide sterilizer, that's 50%, sometimes as high as 70% concentration. So completely different level of concentration. Of course, you have to have that higher level to achieve the desired effect of sterilization. Now, something that I think too few of us know is that the permissible exposure limit for hydrogen peroxide is the same as ethylene oxide. It's 1 part per million. And if you take a look at the IDLH, the immediately dangerous to life and health level, hydrogen peroxide is actually quite a bit lower at 75 parts per million compared to 800 parts per million for ethylene oxide. Now, you might be thinking, why is that? Ethylene oxide gets a ton of attention, and it absolutely should because of the negative health impacts that it has, particularly chronic exposure at low levels. ETO is a known human carcinogen. So it's very useful to know that hydrogen peroxide has that same permissible exposure limit of 1 part per million. A lot of people also don't know that hydrogen peroxide is a known animal carcinogen and a mutagen. It does cause changes to our DNA. Some states, like the state of New Jersey, for example, say to handle it as a possible carcinogen with extreme caution because of some of the health impacts that have been seen. Now, important to note for hydrogen peroxide that there is no OSHA short-term exposure limit. Some of you may be thinking, well, why is that? That seems curious. It would be interesting, I'm sure, for you to learn that the last time the OSHA PELs were updated was in the early 1970s. So a lot of the permissible exposure limits that are out there are relying on quite old data, 50-year-old plus data. And that's why some chemicals like hydrogen peroxide that certainly should have a STEL don't. And so some states, like say Washington State and Hawaii, for example, have adopted their own state level short-term exposure limit of 3 parts per million. And ACGIH says that at no time should people be exposed to more than 5 parts per million. So, we would call on OSHA to look at this, but we would call on all of you as leaders in sterile processing to look at the other guidelines that are out there, because you want to make sure that you're keeping your teams within permissible limits. And when you take all of this together, easy to see why AAMI does recommend vapor monitoring for hydrogen peroxide exposure. Let's shift gears to talk about peracetic acid just for a minute. Of course, PAA is very commonly used today in automated endoscope reprocessors, AERs. PAA is a highly corrosive chemical. It's also a sensitizer, just like glutaraldehyde, for some of you that may remember glutaraldehyde being the high-level disinfectant of choice. What that means is with prolonged exposure, the more you're exposed to a certain chemical, like peracetic acid, you can actually trigger a more severe response. So important to know that when we're working around PAA, and important to understand that's why minimizing the exposure to the greatest extent possible is critically important. So take a look on the slide at these very low recommended exposure limits from ACGIH and NIOSH. ACGIH puts out a threshold limit value of 0.4 parts per million. That's a 15-minute time-weighted average. And NIOSH puts out an IDLH level of 0.64 parts per million as a recommended IDLH. Now, one thing that we don't talk about much and is actually cited in AAMI ST58 2024 is that EPA also puts out acute exposure guidelines for peracetic acid. So you can look in the standard. These are cited directly. There's 3 tiers, AEGL 1, 2, and 3, that talk about exposure limits for PAA. AEGL 1, the first tier, which could cause notable discomfort or irritation, is 0.17 parts per million. AEGL 2, which could cause irreversible or other serious long-term health impacts, is 0.51 parts per million. And AEGL 3, which could be potentially life-threatening, is 1.3 parts per million. Now, I should note that these are 8-hour time-weighted averages, but important to note that EPA recognizes the chronic health impacts of exposure to PAA, and some of those do include occupational asthma. There's links between PAA exposure and occupational asthma and potential lung damage. So AAMI does say in the standard that we should ensure that exposure to chemical solutions and vapors like PAA are kept to a minimum and certainly below the OSHA and ACGIH occupational exposure limits. All right, so we're going to zoom back out. Thanks for kind of taking a detailed look at those chemicals with me. We're going to zoom back out and talk about what do we do about it for the last few minutes here, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So how do we implement the new standards and recommendations in ST58 2024? Well, the first thing to do is familiarize yourself with the document, of course. You want to take a look at the requirements in ST58. You want to identify any potential gaps that you've got in things like chemical monitoring, training, documentation. And then you want to look at things that you might want to consider introducing in the coming weeks, months, quarters. Things like new standard operating procedures, staff training programs, and then also a chemical monitoring program, which will be critical for ensuring compliance with this new standard. One thing that we talk about a lot, which I think is important, is a clinical assessment with some trusted advisors. This is something that is a tremendous tool and resource for you to bring in an unbiased third party to document some corrective actions that you can work on together and to track your improvement and compliance as a high-functioning department, high-functioning organization over time. The other thing we encourage people to take a look at is OSHA's HAZCOM standards. Communication is absolutely key. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the safety data sheets, for example. This is another thing that AAMI recommends. You want to make sure that they're accessible and also understood. And so what do we mean by accessible? Being in the file cabinet in the manager's office or being on a shared drive is not accessible and understood. People should be trained on it. This should be part of your regular training protocols. You want to make sure people understand how to safely handle and use the chemicals in your department. You also want to make sure that this is something we see a lot when there's secondary containers of chemicals. You want to make sure that there's proper labeling on those containers. So what are the ingredients? What are the concentrations of those ingredients? What are any safety considerations and PPE requirements that you need to consider when handling those secondary containers of chemicals? Very, very important in the department, particularly ones that are very busy and moving at a fast pace. The other thing that we talk about is standard operating procedures, of course. What PPE should you wear when you're performing certain functions or tasks, for example? What gloves should you wear when you're unloading the hydrogen peroxide sterilizer? How should you unload the hydrogen peroxide sterilizer? A best practice that a lot of departments have incorporated is cracking the door of the sterilizer, taking a step back, and if they've got a monitor in place, making sure that monitor reads 0 before you go ahead and reach in and take out that tray. That's a tremendous way to mitigate unnecessary exposure to a chemical like hydrogen peroxide. Now, of course, monitoring is a key piece, as we've talked about, of compliance with ST58. There's a lot of different options for that. There's a lot of different ways that you can monitor in your department. But we want to make a couple of points here related to what's not best practice, what's not adequate for monitoring. And AAMI does describe an ideal vapor monitor in Annex P. So you can go and take a look at that after this workshop. But first and foremost, odor, relying on odor as an indicator. We talked right up front in the presentation about why that's not the best thing to do. Something smelling too strong, it's probably too late at that point. You've been overexposed. Not a good practice to be following. Same with visual inspection. You don't want to say, hey, I see some haze or mist or something like that, so let's go check it out and make sure we don't have levels above the established requirements. Hydrogen peroxide and PAA vapors, you can't see them typically. And so that's not something that you want to rely on. Of course, you want to make sure you've got ventilation systems in place, above the hydrogen peroxide sterilizers and things like that. But relying on those types of engineering controls alone, just like the sterilizers themselves, sometimes they can and do fail. Sometimes it may be turned off for some reason, and then you have some type of an incident. You want to make sure that everything's working together, and you're not overly relying on one particular technology. There's layers to safety that are important to take into consideration. And then finally, spot checking with handheld monitors and badge monitoring. Absolutely a step in the right direction. A great way to get some understanding of your department and see where your levels are. The challenge there, particularly with badge monitoring, is that it's reactive, not proactive. You're wearing a badge for a shift. You're sending it off to a lab, and within a day or two, you get the readings back to see if you were overexposed. Much more adequate to be knowing in the moment what's in the air so you can take action and do something about it. And so these bullet points kind of summarize what ST58 says is the ideal vapor monitoring in Annex P. So you want to make sure that you're looking for something that provides continuous and instantaneous readings. You want to make sure that you limit false alarms by making sure there's no cross sensitivities to other chemicals in the department. You absolutely want to make sure that you're paying attention to both the 8-hour permissible exposure limit and the 15-minute short-term exposure limit, the STEL. If you take nothing away from this workshop, just remember, no STEL makes no sense. We want to make sure we're focusing on acute exposure in the department to minimize what our team members are breathing in. And then you want to make sure your logging data and maintenance is kept to a minimum. So what should I do now? Before we open it up for questions and answers, the first thing that you should do is take a look at the document, take a look at the standard, strive for compliance, review your team communications and training protocols, consider that third-party clinical assessment. I think you'd get a lot of value out of that. It's a great way to take stock of where you are right now and identify and prioritize some actions that you can take to get closer to compliance with ST58 and a host of other standards for that matter. As AAMI encourages you to do and suggests, talk with the suppliers of the chemicals, talk with the manufacturers of the sterilization equipment, talk with the manufacturers of the gas monitoring equipment when you're thinking about implementing that chemical monitoring program. And then the last thing, I say this a lot, I think this is really important, be a champion for safety in your department. When you go to your huddle tomorrow morning or the next time you're going in to the facility, ask some questions about familiarity with ST58, about compliance. Make sure that we're being advocates for change in our department. It's a critical thing, and it's a role that anybody can play, whether you're a junior technician or a leader that's got years of tenure in the department. So I hope that this was a really helpful conversation for you. It's a lot to pack in just over 30 minutes. So we will stick around for 10 minutes or so for Q&A. I want to say thanks again to ASSI. Thanks to the team at ChemDAC. It's awesome to do this live. We appreciate everybody's support. And I think at this point, we will open it up for questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex. That was a lot of good information. And what we're here to do is to help translate that into, okay, tomorrow, next week, next month. So thank you, Alex. What a good question / suggestion by the great VP of HSPA, Damian Berg, was, has there been any representation on the FGI committee's classification of workspaces that use chemicals? This is a huge consideration on design and regulation that's followed by healthcare facilities. Alex, you want to take that? That's a really good question / suggestion by Damian. Thanks, Damian, for that question.
Yeah, Jimmy, great question. Damian, I think that the more representation that we can get from different groups on multiple committees, the better result we're going to get, right? So, I think part of the reason that ST58, the ST58 update was such a success was that there was representation from the chemical suppliers, the sterilizer manufacturers, key leaders and influencers in the industry. I think what you're suggesting is that the more people that get involved, the better standards that we're going to have, because we're taking everybody's perspective and input into consideration. Certainly Jamid or Vanessa, if you want to add to that, by all means. But I think it's a great point by Damian.
No, it is a really good point. And I think the first hurdle was getting it into the document that the industry recognizes, because, the information that you shared with us and that ultimately made it into the document was all over the place. So if you were not an expert, you would have to click on several different links and go to different websites and purchase different books to get that information.
Right.
So I feel like this is step one. And then the next step is working with FGI. And if you don't know who FGI is, remember when we used to have the AAMI temperature and humidity, and now we use the ASHRAE 170 FGI guidelines. That's the group that's based here in Atlanta that kind of helps with healthcare building facility design. And so I think that's the next step now that we have a single book to take instead of a whole library of books to take pages out of. So,
I mean, yes, totally agree. My brain is still trying to wrap around the fact that hydrogen peroxide is somewhere on the carcinogenic scale. Again, it's one of the, like you said, buy it in the grocery store, but super concentrated, super dangerous.
Well, I mean, think about this, Vanessa, right? So the bleach that we get out of the bottle, to wash our clothes, right? They recommend that we dilute it sometimes 1 to 4, 1 to 10. It's not meant to be exposed. And if you leave that bottle open too long, then that's the same thing. The hydrogen peroxide that we take for granted in our house, that's 3%. But the ones that are being used in the sterilization machines are at 59, 58%, which is significantly stronger. So
absolutely,
you might play around with the brown bottle, but you don't want to play around with those cassettes or cups.
Yeah.
I did not see any further questions. A lot of statements. And I think everybody online here really enjoyed their time with you. Do you have any? Oh, go ahead.
I had something before Alex closes us out. So if you are a team member or leader, you're like, wow. Right? And it seems like this whole big thing to do. But it really starts off, let's kind of do like a book club together reading of ST58, right? And then the next step is to develop an action plan, right?
Yes.
And I think one of the things that we could do a better job of as sterile processing leaders is justifications. And there are several places that can help you out, like the one on this webinar, but writing a justification for doing something different, right? And Alex did a great job of laying out different options. And it's not like next week we have to have this full program. What it's really about is let me understand what my risks are. What does AAMI say? What does NIOSH say? What does OSHA say? And so as you start covering those bases, you start developing a program. Because I don't think this is not a sales thing, right? This is not a sales thing, and this is not a scare people into doing something thing. This is really, 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 really about, all right, let's start doing something. Because if your take on this is they are just trying to sell something, I'm going to keep doing what I was doing yesterday, which was nothing. Then you have to look in the mirror and figure out, whether you're a team member or a leader, is this really what you want to do? Because you have to push the ball forward some way. And so you start taking those baby steps, start learning more about it. And then you can call in help. So it's not like you need to get off the phone and call in some help. Start learning some stuff about it. Start saying, oh, this is what now I'm stuck. Let me reach out to one of these experts that can help me get unstuck. So.
Yeah, well said, Jamid. And I think, first and foremost, we're educators, right? And I'll say on behalf of the three of us, I mean, it's an honor to be able to talk about this because it's something that doesn't get talked about a lot or enough. And so, education and awareness first over everything. And I think under that heading, a little teaser for what you might see coming down the line. The next step is to engage in that dialogue with your peers and what are they doing to ensure compliance with ST58 and other standards that have recently been updated by AAMI and other organizations. So be on the lookout for more from the ChemDAC and ASSI collaboration. And we'll look forward to continuing to drive discussions in this space. And again, thanks so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And have a great rest of your week. Stay safe.
Thank you all.
Thank you.